I'm Cosma, and I'm a postdoc at the National Research Council of Italy. And today I'm going to talk about the vulnerability of tidal morphologies of tidal morphology to relative sea level rise in the Venice lagoon. So coastal wetland show a really high variability in terms of morphologies, including salt marshes, intertidal and subtidal flat, and tidal channels and creeks, which we will be calling in brief tidal morphologies. This high variability of morphologies promote biodiversity and provides and allow the development of some of the most important and valued ecosystem worldwide. This environment is one of the most vulnerable and most threatened to relative sea level rise, which can cause a huge loss in these tidal morphologies and in their variability, and results in a flattening and a deepening of these kind of tidal morphologies, with consequences on loss of biodiversity and therefore ecosystem services. The high variability of this environment, which is strictly related to the ground, their elevation, the variability in and the subsurface heterogeneities, and in the variability of land subsidence, makes also the vulnerability really highly variable in this kind of environment, and therefore their vulnerability are really site-specific and depend on local condition. Therefore, when it comes to vulnerability assessment, it is fundamental to consider all these different characteristics using site-specific approaches. Quantifying vulnerability of tidal morphologies to relative sea level rise is of paramount importance to assess their resilience and to understand the area where the most critical area, which is important to plan possible mitigation measure. We here propose to assess tidal morphologies vulnerabilities through an index-based approach, which allow to take into consideration a lot of these different characteristics that otherwise cannot be considered together. And we do so in the Venice lagoon, which has some site-specific characteristics, which I'm going to show you in the next few slides. So the present-day configuration of the lagoon is due to the combination between the natural evolution of the lagoon together with the human intervention in that. The lagoon started to form around 10,000 years before present because of the Holocene marine transgression, which reached its maximum ingression at about 6,000 years before present. Since the lagoon was located always in this transitional environment, its shape was influenced by the interaction between river and also the waves and tide that interacted together, changing the position and shifting the inner margin and the coastline of the lagoon, and also creating a really complex stratigraphic, such as the one that you see in the bottom figure. Several human interventions change this, this natural evolution, and some of them are the diversion of major rivers outside of the lagoon to prevent its siltation, the construction of the embankment in the inner margin to protect farther inland area, the construction of jettings and stern surges at the inlet to prevent the Venice city center. And all these different interventions impact the hydrodynamics of the lagoon and the sediment exchange, and makes the lagoon a sediment a sediment-starved system. Furthermore, groundwater exploitation until the 70s caused an irreversible damage in terms of land subsidence. All these combined together leads to the present-day configuration of the lagoon, which consists of a series of salt marshes located mostly in the northeastern and in the southeastern part of the lagoon, several intertidal flats quite widespread all over, and subtidal platform mainly located in the central basin. All these morphologies are cut by tidal channels that branches out from the tree inlet, and these channels allow water, sediments, and nutrient exchange. The lagoon is the largest brackish water body of the Mediterranean Sea and shows a tidal range of about 1 meter. So going through the method we apply, so we assess the vulnerability of tidal morphology through an index-based approach that combines the hazard and the sensitivity indicators to compute vulnerability. Just few definition. So the hazard is those indicators that describes the physical variable that cause the vulnerability, in this case the relative sea level rise, whereas sensitivity indicators describe the intrinsic properties of the tidal morphologies that influence the vulnerability, and the vulnerability is the propension of a system to be negatively affected by relative sea level rise, which shortly speaking means that the propension to lose this kind of morphology. So we set up, the first step we did is the setting up of the thematic layers. So we select all the different indicators that contribute to the hazard and sensitivity part. Then we, for each of these layer, we prepare and we homogenize the data, and we gridded them in a regular cell. And then we also classify them in 5 different classes of importance according to their contribution to the vulnerability, which makes them possible, which allow the comparison between the different set of data. We then compute the hazard and sensitivity maps through a linearly weighted combination of the different thematic layers. And then at the end, we compute the vulnerability map, which is the combination between the hazard and sensitivity map. We do so for the ongoing condition of relative sea level rise, but also we updated all the indicators that are affected by relative sea level rise for past and future condition, to be able to have vulnerability map also for those conditions. I will going to show you briefly all the different thematic hazard and sensitivity layer, and then we will look at the vulnerability maps. So as the hazard, we combine sea level rise and vertical land movement. We consider 3 different scenarios of sea level rise for the past, ongoing, and future condition, with data coming from time series analysis of tidal gauge for the past and ongoing condition, with the sea level rise adding to 1.5 millimeter per year and 3.5 millimeter per year. And we, for the future scenario, we use the report from the EPCC, considering a sea level rise of 6.5 millimeter. Land subsidence, the vertical land movement has value up to 10 millimeter per year, and we use data from a work of Tosi and colleague, 2020, which use interferometric point target analysis on sediment data. We classified the vertical line movements with in 5 different classes of importance. Lower value of vertical movements fall in the 0 class, which means that has a lower contribution to vulnerability, whereas higher vertical movements relate to higher vulnerability. And these, combining sea level rise and relative sea and land subsidence, we obtain the different hazard map for the past, ongoing, and future scenario. And you can see here that the highest hazard classes are located in the northeastern and the southwestern part of the lagoon, where salt marshes, most of the salt marshes are located. Going to the sensitivity, the selected sensitivity indicators are related to the shallow subsurface stratigraphy, the ground elevation, and the morphological variability, which describe the characteristic of the tidal morphologies that can influence their vulnerability. So in the following slide, I show you the 3D geologic, the stratigraphic model and ground elevation model we created, which are essential for the definition of these different indicators. So we use a huge amount of literature data and geologics map, and we analyze core and seismic data in order to create the 3D stratigraphic model of the subsurface. For ground elevation model, we further more consider LIDAR, bathymetric, and tandemix data available for the area, and we create a series of maps with the main stratigraphic surfaces and with the different thickness of the main units, stratigraphic unit, that I'm going to show you. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you the sketch, the conceptual model we have for the stratigraphic model. At the base of our model, there's the boundary between the Pleistocene and Holocenes, which correspond to a major subaerial unconformity, and this is considered to be a relatively stable reference in terms of flat subsidence, and we consider this as the base of our model because most of the subsidence in the area is due to the Holocene compaction of the deposits. The first unit is considered to be, it's called the lower mud unit, which was deposited during marine transgression in a fine, it consists of fine-grained deposits developing a back barrier and estuarine environment. The other 2 units we consider are the upper, were deposited during the marine high stand, and they progressively aggraded and prograded toward the sea. The upper mud unit consists of fine-grained deposits deposited in the lagoon environment, whereas the outer sand unit consists of coarse-grained deposits related to the barrier island system that bound the lagoon toward the sea. And here you can see the main stratigraphic unit we created, the map of this stratigraphic unit. So there's the plan view and the 3D visualization of this unit. This is the top lower mud unit, and then the top sand and the top upper mud unit and the ground elevation. From these unit, we extrapolated the thickness of the different unit, which were used to the vulnerability analysis. Another important indicator we consider describe the variability of the morphologies. This is essential essentially calculated as the standard deviation of ground elevation and for each node in an area of 200 per 200 meter. And we consider that the higher the variability of the morphology, the higher will be the vulnerability. And here you can see the classification of the sensitivity indicators, which is based on equal interval. In the upper row, you see the thickness of the different units, where the thicker is the unit, the most vulnerable it will be the area. In the second row, you can see the ground elevation for the different condition, past, ongoing, and future condition. And here we consider that the most vulnerable area will be those really close to the mean sea level, which will be more affected to the relative sea level increase. In the last row, you can see the morphological variability. In here, you can see that there's the higher variability will turn into higher vulnerabilities. And this is the results for the different scenarios for the sensitivity map. By combining the sensitivity and ZAR map, we obtain the vulnerability map. From this analysis, the most vulnerable area of the lagoon are highlighted in orange, red, and purple, which are located in the northeastern and southwest part of the lagoon, where most of salt marshes are located. You can see here, and also from the graph, that there's a progressive, a general worsening of the condition of the vulnerability of these morphologies, with a general decrease in the negligible and marginal class toward the ongoing and future scenario, and with an increase of the strong and extreme condition of the lagoon. From the power of this analysis is that you can see at a glance that the most vulnerable area of the lagoon, which will require further investigation and which will need more attention in terms of mitigation plan that will need to preserve the variability of these tidal morphologies. And it's clear that this vulnerability depends on the local characteristics of the area. So, for example, the highest the most vulnerable area are related to the area where there's the highest subsidence, where there are the subsurface is consisted by the thicker and less consolidated unit, and where the morphology has a higher variability. In his case, from the morphology figure, you can see that the margin of the salt marshes will be the most affected by are the most vulnerable, whereas the less vulnerable area are those where subsidence is less, where the elevation is much farther from the mean sea level, and where the morphologies are almost there's a less variability in the morphology. So, as a final remarks, we propose with this study we propose an easy-to-use approach to assess vulnerability of tidal morphologies, which combines otherwise non-comparable data. We depict the overall picture of the evolution of the vulnerability of tidal morphologies in the Venice lagoon for past, ongoing, and future relative sea level rate scenarios. And we reveal the high variability of vulnerability due to site-specific characteristics and local heterogeneities, and we provide a valuable decision-making tool for management authorities to support land use and conservation policy, particularly for the restoration of lost salt marshes. And now we already started to collaborate with ecologists and to consider also ecosystem services. They are primarily related to these morphologies, and we are planning to include several maps of these ecosystem services among the sensitivity indicators in order to create specific maps for different ecosystem services. And that's it, and I thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Marta. One quick question.
Thanks a lot, Marta, for this great talk. I've three very small questions connected to each other. It's connected to your future relative sea level rise projections. So you use PS-INSAR. So how comfortable are you that the PS-INSAR reflects also the movement of the salt marsh? That's one. And then secondly, how comfortable are you to project that at a linear rate into the future? Because I think you put a linear rate behind the projections correctly. And then the third one, do you expect and account for any of the feedbacks related to changing in relative elevation and perhaps resedimentation on the salt marshes and changes in these sediment dynamics that will actually also create a non-linearity in your elevation evolution?
So what we actually did is update the dam and the morphology, the indicators by, it's I mean it's just we shift them according to the local lead subsidence and to the relative sea level rise. And of course, we were not able to consider the possible feedbacks that turns into variation in the morphologies. But at the same time, what you do in this kind of assessment is that you need also to classify all these different layers. So the error you made not considering this kind of morphological variation is still within, it's easy that it will fall within the same class of vulnerabilities. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Thanks, that's good, thanks.
Thank you very much, Marta.
Thank you.